Evening. It's a wonderful evening. I'm Irene Etkin Goldman, Board Chair of the Coalition for Peace Action. And the Coalition is a regional organization based in Princeton, New Jersey. And in sponsoring this important conversation with our longtime friend, Larry Hamm, we are addressing the epidemic of police brutality on everyone's mind. And we express our appreciation to Not in Our Town and the People's Organization for Progress for co-sponsoring our event with us. So let me pass along the screen to the Coalition for Peace Action's Executive Director, Reverend Bob Moore, who will continue to moderate the conversation. Thank you for coming, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Irene. And I think this is going to be an excellent program tonight. I just want to give you a quick overview of what we have planned. I will very shortly introduce our keynote speaker, Larry Hamm, of the People's Organization for Progress. He will, while he's speaking, people can actually start submitting any questions they might have through the chat box, and that's going to be directed to me. I'll post that very shortly in the chat box so everybody can see it. At the end of Larry's talk, we're going to have two other people add brief remarks, and that is Lou Maltby of the Princeton Civil Rights Commission and Caroline Clark of Not in Our Town, Princeton, which is one of our co-sponsors. After those two have spoken, we're going to turn to the question and answer period. And I will be going through the questions, grouping them together, trying to pick out as many of them as I can. We want to get through as many of those questions. I find that to be one of the most engaging and lively parts of these gatherings. So do be thinking about what you'd like to ask, and you don't have to, wait even till the end of anybody's talk. You can be posting it to me as things are moving along, and I'll be taking a look at those. So again, welcome. We're pleased to have you tonight as a part of this webinar on the epidemic of police brutality in our country. Let me just briefly, it's an honor actually for me to introduce our keynote speaker, Larry Hamm. Larry is an African-American community activist. He was born in Newark and became a spokesperson for the educational needs of Newark students at the age of 17, and was appointed to the Newark Board of Education, making him the youngest school board member in the United States, serving from 1971 to 1974. Larry has been a leader against police brutality in our region for decades. And one of the things that impresses me the most about Larry, and the reason I immediately thought of him as an appropriate keynote speaker for this event, is he doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk. And he's been doing that for decades. And sometimes he literally walks the walk, as a year and a half ago when he organized a walk all the way from Newark to Trenton to advocate for subpoena power for civilian review boards who can help restrain the police from doing the horrible acts of brutality at least some officers have been doing. So we were honored to co-sponsor that event. We're honored to have Larry tonight. I've known him through many struggles, including against the Iraq War and lots of racial justice activities. We are so fortunate tonight to have as our keynote speaker, Larry Hamm of the People's Organization for Progress. Larry.
Thank you, Reverend Moore. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and good evening to everyone who has joined this program for tonight. I know some of you, I've known some of you for some years now, and it's good to see that we're all still on the road, on the path to struggle for justice. And At our ages, I think some of us are going to be on that path until we get there. So it's good to be with you. Today is February the 7th. And believe it or not, it is actually the anniversary of the beginnings, the origins of Black History Month. I know many in our audience tonight probably know this story, but for the benefit of the few who don't, I just want to say a little bit about the origins of Black History Month. Black History Month was actually created by is credited to Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson was the son of parents who had been born into slavery, who lived in West Virginia, and he himself had had some experience working in the coal mines of West Virginia, but he received probably one would consider it at that time a miraculous opportunity to attend Harvard University. His academic and intellectual gifts were recognized early on, and that helped pave the way for him to attend Harvard University and become the second Black person to receive a PhD in history from Harvard University. And many of you probably know who the first person was. That was W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the greatest intellectuals that American society has produced. And by the way, his birthday is the 23rd of February. There are a lot of historic dates in the month of February. But Carter G. Woodson studied history, and of course, he was trying to get that information he needed to combat white supremacy. The idea that African Americans were an inferior race that had no history and culture to speak of was very current at the turn of the 20th century. And Black intellectuals who were part of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the talented 10th put themselves to work to, in fact, explode this very hateful mythology, the mythology of racism, the idea that they are inferior and superior races, and to recover the historical legacy of Black people, which had been erased during the period of enslavement. Many of you know what happened to Black people once we were taken from our homeland and brought here to the Western Hemisphere. It was against the law for us to speak our own language. It was against the law for us to have our own names. It was even against the law for us to use the drum, because the drum, we knew how to make it talk, and we used it as an instrument of insurrection. So everything that was African about us had to be erased, because in order to enslave a people, you have to have a rationale to justify it. And Eric Williams, in his benchmark work, Capitalism and Slavery, which I would urge everybody to read, talks about how racism as we know it, that's not to say that there wasn't racial bias and ideas that could be considered racist and prejudiced before the mid-Atlantic slave trade, but the development of white supremacy into a systemic ideology arose and throve with the slave trade which was the foundation of capitalism in the Western Hemisphere. So everything about us that was African had to be erased. Our history, our knowledge of our homeland, the civilizations that we had in Africa. And please, please keep in mind that the history of African Americans does not start with slavery. We have a history that is as old as mankind. Most people in this audience probably know by now that modern anthropologists, most anthropologists have proven that mankind, Homo sapiens sapien, the origins of Homo sapiens sapiens are in Africa. And it was the outward migration from Africa onto the other continents around the world that was the beginning of mankind. The oldest remnants of early man were found in Africa, in the eastern part, in Ethiopia and Tanzania, even in southern Africa. And so we had great civilizations, despite what you see on the History Channel, where I really can't understand how the History Channel could have programs on there that would say that aliens from another planet built the pyramids, when we all know that African people built those pyramids and built those civilizations. Africa, Kush, Nubia, Ethiopia, Great Zimbabwe, Songhai, Mali, Timbuktu. I could go on and on about the civilizations that existed in northeast, south, and west of the African continent. And so Carter G. Woodson and W.E.B. Du Bois and many others studied our history and recovered our history, and they were determined to make sure people knew this history. So when Carter G. Woodson returned home, he started writing columns for Black newspapers on African American history and African history. And as you can imagine, at the turn of the century, there was still a lot of people who could not read. So what would happen is that Carter Woodson would write these columns and people would take them to church. And when church service was over, the people would stay back. And one of the people that could read would stand before the congregation and read the latest column from Carter G. Woodson. It's out of this practice that the idea of Negro History Week was born. And I know a lot of people say, well, see, they cheated us with Black History Month because they gave us the shortest month of the year. And a lot of people thought that. But the truth is, if you read Carter G. Woodson, he set Negro History Week during the week that had both February 12th and February 14th, because February 12th was the birthday of Abraham Lincoln, and February 14th was the chosen birthday of Frederick Douglass, because Frederick Douglass really didn't know his real birthday. He chose February the 14th to be his birthday. The records were not kept well of slaves' births and deaths. So February 12th and February 14th were the birthdays of the two giants of the American Civil War and the giant of the abolitionist movement for the abolition of slavery, Frederick Douglass. He chose that week, the second week of February, and he started on February 7th. That's when the first Negro History Week was organized by Carter G. Woodson. And then over time, Negro History Week became Negro History Month. And then as the Black consciousness movement caught fire, and people stopped calling themselves colored and Negro. I'm 69 years old, so I grew up in that period when we did call ourselves. In fact, in my household, the word colored was probably used more often than the word Negro. But by 1967, James Brown made that song, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. And so Negro History Month became Black History Month. And by the way, in New Jersey, Black History Month was first officially recognized through a resolution introduced by the first Black woman senator in the history of New Jersey. That was Winona Lippman. She introduced, I believe it was in 1971, a resolution in the state legislature, which was passed by the legislature to officially recognize Black History Month. And then it was under President Gerald Ford that he issued the first executive order of a president to recognize Black History Month. And so Black History Month is observed by many throughout the country, and believe it or not, around the world. And in other countries, people have their own Black History Month. I was listening to a show this morning on WBAI, and they were talking to a young man from Scotland. And in October, they observe Black History Month in October to discuss the Black presence in Scotland. I know many people I didn't know there was a Black presence in Scotland, but believe it or not, Black people have been just about all over this world, on every continent on the planet. And so that's the origin of Black History Month. And I want to tie that to our topic tonight, which is talking about the fight, the struggle to end police brutality in our country. I have with me a book. The title of this book is Freedom. I hope everybody can see it. And it's a photographic history of the African-American struggle. It was edited by Dr. Manning Marable, whom I presume many of you know a little about. Manning Marable. He's written a lot on Black history and Black politics. And I wanted to show you this picture in this history book. I hope everybody can see it. This picture is a picture of a meeting taking place in Washington, D.C. in 1920. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a sign right here. I don't know if you can read it. That sign says, "Fight Police Brutality." In 1920, police brutality was already a serious problem that people were protesting against. That photograph, this is 2023, so that photograph is 103 years old. And police brutality was a problem before then, but I just thought it was amazing that there was a photo of people protesting various issues, but one of those issues was police brutality, and that's in this book, Freedom, edited by Dr. Manning Marable. So to understand the problem of police brutality, we have to understand its roots. And I'm going to give you my particular opinion and my perspective. And if you want to debate, we could do that during the questions and answer period. But myself and others actually believe that to understand the problem of police brutality, you have to understand the history of the use of force against Black people and other people of color in the United States. The American colonies, the colonies of other European countries in the Western Hemisphere, these colonies were founded with the use of force, some of the most unimaginable and brutal force that human beings could engage in. Many of you already know about the genocidal efforts against the indigenous people, the Native Americans. For 100 years before Africans were imported in large numbers brought in large numbers to the Western Hemisphere. We've been in the Western Hemisphere. That's another lecture about how long African people have been in the Western Hemisphere. But in terms of the slave trade, the mass movement, forced movement of Black people from Africa into the Western Hemisphere, 100 years before that, there was the enslavement of the indigenous people, the Native Americans. And their enslavement begins with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Western Hemisphere in 1492. The Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, the ships on which Columbus and his crew sailed, these were slave ships. And on Columbus's very first voyage, he took slaves and brought slaves back to Spain. On his plantations and those of his sons, they enslaved indigenous people. And the brutal force was used against the indigenous people. Many of them were massacred. Many of them died from diseases that Europeans brought into the Western Hemisphere. In his own journals, Columbus talks about orders that he gave to the indigenous people. He told them to bring him a thimbleful of gold every day, and those that did not comply, their hands would be chopped off. And some of the worst kinds of torture was documented by the monk, the friar Bartholomew de las Casas. And it was so bad. The flailing, I don't know if people know what flailing is. That's skinning human beings alive, burning people alive, torturing people to death. It was so bad that de las Casas went to the king and queen of Spain and complained, and a debate broke out in Europe. And initially, de las Casas said, we should not do these things. We should not enslave the indigenous people because they have souls. But if we must have slaves, we can enslave the African because the African has no soul. You can read this in Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. You can also read it in From Columbus to Castro by Eric Williams. So brutal force of the most unimaginable kind had to be used against the indigenous people to, in fact, take their land. But they had to have a labor force to work the land. And so that began the mid-Atlantic slave trade. And Africans were actually here before 1619. Even in the Spanish colony of Florida, there were already settlements with enslaved Africans. But the mass forced importation of Africans into the Western Hemisphere pretty much begins with the mid-Atlantic slave trade. And everybody knows about the 1619 Project and the attempt to explain that, explain the institution of slavery that happened. But you know the story. A Dutch frigate lands at Point Comfort, which was in Jamestown, Virginia. The first Africans, in fact, were not enslaved. They were indentured servants, a kind of short-term slavery, like the difference between ownership and leasing. So people were leased out for 7 years at a time. But eventually, it was a process that took about 40 years for enslavement to become coterminous with being African. And there's a whole nother lecture on why and how that happened. It had a lot to do with property rights and patriarchy and inheritance and on and on and on. But eventually, by about 1660, most of the American colonies had laws that said that if you were born to an African mother, you were enslaved in perpetuity. Now, anyone that knows about slavery knows it's a basic fact that people will resist being enslaved. It always was the case. You know, slavery is an old institution. Slavery didn't begin with the African slave trade in North America. Slavery is almost as old as civilization itself. We see the beginnings of slavery with the development of large-scale agriculture and farming in early human settlements. And there was slavery in Europe. In fact, there were enslaved Africans in Europe before there was slavery in America. Columbus learned the skills of navigation in the slave trade. The Portuguese were already going down the west coast of Africa in the 1500s. And there were plantations in Southern Europe already. In fact, the word factory, I believe, is a Portuguese origin, barracks where enslaved people were kept. But so slavery moved out as the European powers began their colonial and imperialist adventures, their project into the Western Hemisphere, into North and South America. So the worst kind of force imaginable had to be used against African people to keep them enslaved. There was the force of the state, that is the force of the colonial government or governments in the various colonies. But there was also the force which by law, the masters of slaves had. They could dole out the worst types of punishment, torture, mutilation, whippings of all kinds. It's a horrible, horrible business. But yet it became such a big business in the United States because people made money from it. In fact, the institution of slavery was probably the most dynamic industry in America. By 1860, the largest form of capital, larger than industrial capital and banking capital combined, was the investment in slavery. Whole cities on the coasts of Europe and England sprang up on economies based either on the goods that slave labor produced or the instruments themselves which were used to enslave people. Some of the cities in England had in their coat of arms the elephant, which was an African creature, because their economies grew up on the production of chains, on the production of manacles, on the production of leg irons, and on and on and on, guns and cannons, everything that was needed to, in fact, force people into enslavement. And slaves rebel. From the beginning, they rebelled. Anybody who says that Black people were satisfied with slavery, were happy with slavery, they clearly are lying. Black people rebelled against slavery in Africa, rebelled on the slave ships, rebelled once they arrived here in the Western Hemisphere, in North America. Herbert Apteker, in his book, Slave Rebellions in Colonial America, says that there were over 400 recorded slave rebellions in the American colonies, and probably many more that were not recorded. And there were other kinds of rebellions, beside mass uprisings of enslaved people. People found all kinds of ways to rebel against their enslavers, and we could go into those at another time. But people rebelled. So you had to have an organized force. You had to have the force of the state to keep enslaved people in their condition, in their place. And so what arose in the colonies were slave patrols. And these slave patrols existed not only in colonies of the South, but in colonies of the North. Slavery was not just a Southern phenomenon. Slavery was a national phenomenon. Even here in New Jersey, there was slavery. New Jersey, New York was a Dutch colony. I think they called it New Amsterdam. And when the British and the Dutch fought and the Dutch lost their war, they lost that war, they lost many of their colonies. So, you know, Amsterdam is in the Netherlands, what they call Holland at that time. So New Amsterdam became New York. York was in England. Jersey was in England. It became New York and New Jersey. The colony that became New Jersey was founded in 1620. By 1624, there were enslaved African people here in New Jersey, building roads, building dams, building houses, clearing the land, and so on and so forth, engaging in industry and in commerce to make their masters wealthy. But you had to have these slave patrols to put down slave rebellions. And there were many slave rebellions. Most of us probably have some knowledge of the rebellions of Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and many others. But there were many other slave rebellions, some large scale, some small scale. But you had to have organized men who were given the authority to put down, to kill, to maim, brutalize, if necessary, to put down the slave rebellions. And Apteker says that it is out of these slave patrols that modern police forces begin to arise. In fact, not too long ago, I heard the former commissioner of the New York Police Department give a speech to newly sworn in police officers, a class of newly graduated police officers. And Bratton said to them, he said the New York police force evolved from the slave patrols of New Amsterdam. And you can Google that and find out when and where he said it. And I know it might be hard for a lot of people to grasp that idea that police as we know them evolved out of slave patrols. But when you look at the behavior of some of these police, they think it looks like they're still on slave patrol. So out of these slave patrols, and Apteker says particularly after the Civil War, when Black people were migrating out of the South into the North and into the West, that's when a lot of cities began to organize these constable forces. In some places they were called constables, in other places they were called police. But these organized forces, and what was one of their major activities? One of their major activities was to return runaway slaves. And you know, this is even included in the Constitution. It doesn't say the word slaves, it talk about property, but there were runaway slaves, and one of the main activities of these police forces were to return runaway slaves. Many of you probably on certain days of the week, you see these armored vehicles going to the banks and getting the money to take them wherever they take the money, you know. But some of these security forces like Pinkertons, their business early in the 19th century, or well, really in the mid 19th century, their business was runaway slaves. And some of you probably saw that movie, 12 Years a Slave, where even free Black people lived in terror. They could literally be snatched off the streets and brought to a plantation, because some of them had been born free, but they were free people. And because of the color of their skin, they would be snatched and spirited away, forcefully taken away and taken, you know, that term, sold down the river. you Many of you probably use that term. Well, that evolved out of that experience. They gone down the river, back down south, back to some plantation as close as Maryland. There were plantations, and there were places in Jersey too. But Pinkertons and others, you know, a number of companies made vast amounts of money having to do with slavery. And this is one of the points when we talk about reparations, and that's a discussion for another time. But there are a lot of companies that are in existence today. These companies that exist today, some of them are the descendants of original companies that were involved in the slave trade. Even companies like insurance, Lloyd's of London began insuring slave ships. But going back to the main topic here, so these slave patrols existed. They were a forerunner of policing. And then at the end of the Civil War, when people began to migrate out of the South, and remember, there were waves of migration. Initially, you know, a lot of people were staying in place because they thought they were going to get that 40 acres. You know, that was a real thing. It wasn't made up. General Sherman, when he was going through the South, he confiscated 400,000 acres in the areas of Georgia and Savannah and South Carolina, and gave that land to enslaved people. And that was done with Military General Order number 15. And then on the basis of General Order number 15, Thaddeus Stevens introduces in the House of Representatives H.R. 29, a bill which would have made law that any formerly enslaved person would receive 40 acres and $50, you know, either themselves or if they were the survivors of someone who fought and died in the Civil War. That bill passed the House, but it never passed the Senate because there was an interruption, and that was the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And his vice president, Andrew Johnson, was a Southern sympathizer. When Johnson took Lincoln's place, he issued executive orders that would return all that land that Sherman had confiscated back to the slave masters. And we've been fighting for that 40 acres ever since. So Black people begin to move into the North. And that's when you see in a lot of towns and cities, the passage of vagrancy laws and other kinds of strange laws, which were really designed to imprison Black people and then re-enslave Black people. These vagrancy laws and loitering laws and so on and so forth. So this begins after the Civil War. And what you see in the 19th century, people are already having problems with the police. And so toward I guess the latter part of the 19th century, police commissions come into being. These were the antecedents of what we call today police review boards, because people were having problems with the police. The police were pretty brutal, not just to Black people, but to other people, you know, that they came in contact with if they thought they were breaking some kind of law. And the other thing was, remember, the police were not only used against Black people, they were also used against labor. Remember, at one time, it was against the law for people to form unions. And when people went on strike, the police were called in. If they couldn't break the strike, the National Guard was called in. And if they couldn't break the strike, the Army was called in. So people are having problems with the police, and we see the formation of police commissions, which were places that people could go to complain about the police. But these didn't work out too well. There was a lot of corruption with the police commissions. Cities like Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and others had these police commissions. But over time, the police commissions evolved into police review boards as we know them today. This idea of a police review board, I was first introduced to 52 years ago. Reverend Moore mentioned when I was appointed to the Newark Board of Education. At that time in 1971, I came into contact with the poet, playwright, artist, activist Amiri Baraka. And Amiri Baraka had an organization in Newark called the Committee for Unified Newark. They had played an important role in helping to get the first African-American mayor of Newark, New Jersey elected, Ken Gibson. But the Committee for Unified Newark had put in place a process that involved not just electing representatives, but also coming up with agendas by which we could hold these elected representatives accountable. As many people know, Newark had a rebellion in 1967. People call it the Newark riots. We call it a rebellion because we said it was a collective response to oppression. Almost literally in the midst of that rebellion, a Black Power conference was held in Newark in July of 1967. And that Black Power conference led to a Black Power convention that was held the following year, 1968, at West Kenny Junior High School. And that led to a Black and Puerto Rican convention that was held in 1969. And in each of these conventions, agendas were put together. And in every one of those agendas was the issue of police brutality and the demand for a police review board. My study of the police review board in terms of New Jersey, it seems the earliest manifestation of someone raising that issue was Irvine Turner. Irvine Turner was the first Black person elected to the municipal government of Newark in 300 years. He was elected from the Central Ward, which was the all-Black ward. Newark was very segregated. It was like an apartheid state in the 1960s. It was a majority Black city controlled by a white minority. But the problem of police brutality was real. People were getting killed, they were getting injured. So Irvin Turner said Newark should have a police review board in 1960. And then there was another fellow elected to the New Jersey State Assembly. His name was George Richardson. He introduced a bill in the New Jersey State Legislature that would enable municipalities to create police review boards. Neither of the measures introduced by Irvin Turner on the Newark City Council or the bill introduced by George Richardson, neither of those passed, but the demand, stayed a demand and became a particularly pointed demand during in the aftermath of the 1967 rebellion, because the police put down that rebellion with the utmost force. Newark probably had the second largest rebellion during the 1960s. Many people don't know. I mean, people know about the Newark riots, but just about every major city in New Jersey had a riot. In fact, Newark wasn't even the first. The first one was in Jersey City in 1966. But between 1960 and 1972, there were more than 1,000 urban uprisings in the United States, in 1,000 cities and towns. And almost all of them were precipitated by an incident of police brutality. In Newark, it was the beating of the cab driver, John Smith. People thought he had been beaten to death. They went to the police station where he was being held. They demonstrated. The police came outside en masse. There was a confrontation between the police and the demonstrators, and that led to the uprising, which lasted for 5 days. The police tried to put it down. The 1,300-member police force tried to put it down. They couldn't do it by themselves. Governor Hughes sent in 700 state troopers. The combined force of the state troopers and the police couldn't put it down. So finally, Governor Hughes declared martial law and sent in, called in the National Guard. And that finally put down the rebellion. But the police killed 26 people, injured close to 1,500, and jailed more than 3,000 people as a result of that rebellion in 1967. So when I met Amiri Baraka in 1971, he was already campaigning for police review board. He had a little paper called Unity and Struggle, and it was in the headlines, we need an elected, he even said it should be elected, an elected police review board, because the problems of police brutality continued after the rebellion and up till today in Newark and in other cities. And the question becomes, why don't we have a police review board in New Jersey with subpoena power? We really don't have any functioning police review board in the entire state. How is this when 9 miles away from Newark, New Jersey is New York City, which has had a police review board with subpoena power, disciplinary power, and investigatory power since 1966, and has been further given additional powers since then, even up until this past year? How is it that they have one and we don't have any in the entire state of New Jersey? It's because the police have opposed the creation of police review boards in this state since the 1960s. When the idea was first brought up in the legislature, police organizations hired lobbyists, went down themselves, testified, lobbied in the legislature to stop the passage of any laws that would enable municipalities to form police review boards. Amiri Baraka campaigned on this almost until the day he died, and he died in 2014. His son, Ras Baraka, was elected in 2014, and one of his first executive orders was the creation of a police review board with subpoena power. He structured it so that the city's ombudsman would be part of the review board, and the city's ombudsman does have subpoena power. Immediately, the Fraternal Order of Police, Lodge number 13, which is located in Newark, New Jersey, their headquarters is on Rector Street, they went into court to stop the police review board. They went into Superior Court. They fought the city in Superior Court, and they won because they had a judge, who was for the police, hook, line, and sinker. The city appealed. It won on appeal. But the Fraternal Order Police, the FOP, would not rest. They took it all the way to the state Supreme Court, all the way to the state Supreme Court. And the state Supreme Court of New Jersey ruled that municipalities can form police review boards, but only the state legislature can confer subpoena power upon them. So since that time, several legislators, including McKnight out of Jersey City, I think has been the prime sponsor of bills that would enable municipalities to create police review boards with subpoena powers. What has happened to these bills? Nothing. They have gone nowhere. Now, we know about the George Floyd Accountability and Policing Act in Congress, and we know why it didn't pass in Congress, because of Republican opposition. What is the reason in New Jersey, when New Jersey state government is controlled by Democrats? I'm a Democrat. I voted for Governor Murphy. We have a Democratic governor. We have a state Senate that is majority Democrat. We have a state assembly that is majority Democrat. But the Democratic leadership in the state legislature will not release these bills because there's an assembly version and there's a Senate version. They will not release these bills from committee to the floor for a vote. And this is a scandal because Black people have been probably the most loyal constituency of the Democratic Party. We vote Democrat at rates in these last elections since the presidential election, since the midterms of 18, the presidential election of 20, the gubernatorial election of 21. We've been voting at rates at 85 to 95% for Democrats. Black people support, Black people and white people and some Latino people and people of all races support the idea of police review boards with subpoena power and so forth. But our Democratic leadership in the New Jersey legislature will not bring these bills. This is why there must be a movement against police brutality. People say, what will it take to stop police brutality? Well, it will take everything we got to stop it. Yes, it will take voting for people who openly state they support police reform, they support police review boards, they support the abolition of qualified immunity, they support the abolition of chokeholds, they support bills that would establish a standard for the use of force, and many other reforms. Of course, we need to elect people and put people in there that will fight for these things. We need to write letters to our elected officials and make phone calls, and we need to go down and lobby and do all of that. But we must also protest. We also have to keep the pressure on. In fact, we have to exert greater pressure because it's clear that the pressure that's being exerted now is not enough, because the police brutality, the kind of brutality that was visited upon Tyre Nichols in Memphis, Tennessee, the kind of brutality that was visited upon George Floyd, the kind of brutality visited upon Ahmaud Arbery, the kind of brutality visited upon Carl Dorsey in New Jersey, and Bernard Placide in New Jersey, and the Rodwell Spivey brothers in New Jersey, and on and on and on. It will not end until the police understand that there will be consequences for that behavior. They kill with impunity. Believe me when I tell you. Did you see the way the officers were reacting when Tyre Nichols was disabled on the ground? They were joking about it. Did you hear what the cop said when Tyre Nichols was being beaten? He said, I wish they would stomp his ass. They do this with impunity. Now, all police officers don't do it. I accept that. You know, I'm not trying to make a case against all police officers. But do you know that the police in the United States kill more people than any other police force on the face of the planet Earth? We have the second largest police force on Earth, only surpassed by the People's Republic of China, which should have a larger police force because they got 4 times as many people. We have 335 million. They have 1.2 billion people. Last year, the police in the United States killed 1,176 people. That's the most people killed in a year since they started counting the figures. Obviously, they didn't learn anything from George Floyd. We had massive protests in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, sparked in part by the courage of that she was a girl at that time, a teenager. She had the courage to stand there and videotape that. Being told by the police to stop videotape. She stood there and videotaped it, and we saw the murder of George Floyd in real time. And that sparked worldwide protests, not just in the United States, around the world. In your town, Princeton University, in the town in which I live now, Montclair. Quiet Montclair had some of the biggest demonstrations I had ever seen, bigger than some demonstrations we had in Newark. Do you know that in New Jersey, in the aftermath of George Floyd, there were Justice for George Floyd demonstrations, Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 157 cities and towns. That didn't even happen during the Vietnam War. All across the country and all around the world. And that's what it took to get Chauvin, the officer that killed Floyd, convicted, and the other officers that were with him. And in the aftermath of George Floyd, all kinds of legislation was introduced to reform policing in this country. But once the demonstrations died down, those bills that were introduced went nowhere. There was a lot of smoke, but very little fire. And that goes for New Jersey. So if people want police brutality, my position is I support police review boards, but I am under no illusions that if we get police review boards with subpoena power tomorrow, that will automatically stop police brutality. I support it because it's a progressive reform, because there should be civilian oversight or community control, whichever you please. Those should be in existence. We should have civilian oversight, community control over the police. Because right now, they think they are a power unto themselves. They think they are above the law, and they really are. Qualified immunity gives them an aura of protection from prosecution that the average citizen does not have. If Larry and his friends was to go out here right now and kill somebody, I would probably be caught and arrested. My bail would be set so high, I couldn't get out of jail. I would go from jail to the trial to prison. But this morning, I received a call that the officer who killed Major Gulliadale III, a 30-year Black veteran, 3 tours of duty in Iraq, was in Operation Desert Storm, returned home, returned to his hometown of Newton, New Jersey, to be killed by police on the 4th of July. You can't make this stuff up. Grand jury failed to indict the officer. See, everybody took a sigh of relief from the conviction of Floyd, and the conviction in the Floyd case and the conviction in the Ahmaud Arbery case. But do you know that 90% of police brutality cases don't even go to court because most of the people are too poor to even afford attorneys? And then only about 1% of those actually result in an indictment or conviction. So for every Chauvin who kills a George Floyd that's convicted, There are 1,000 more that go unconvicted. Last week, the same thing. Last week, grand jury came back with a decision not to indict the officer, the Newark police detective that killed Carl Dorsey. It's undisputed by all sides, undisputed, that Dorsey was unarmed when he was shot to death by Officer Rod Simpkins of the Newark, Detective Rod Simpkins of the Newark Police Department. But the grand jury failed to bring an indictment. And one of the other changes that we have to fight for is transparency. These grand jury hearings are closed. We don't know how the case is presented. You know, lawyers have told me, and I know it sounds cliche, but I had lawyers tell me this all the time. This week, they would tell me that if a prosecutor wants to, he can get an indictment for a ham sandwich. But we can't get indictments for these officers that kill unarmed civilians. I mentioned the fact that the police kill over 1,000 people just about every year. Black people are 13% of the population, but we're 35% of the people killed by police. Twice the number of our percentage of the population. So in my humble estimation, the greatest antidote to police brutality is the organized and mobilized people. That's what makes things happen. That's what shakes things up. When people go to sleep, when people become complacent, when people fail to speak out and take action against injustice, that just creates an atmosphere where injustice can thrive. So we need a movement in our state. We're on here tonight because of the efforts of Reverend Moore and his organization. We've been fighting against police brutality for years. We've been part of coalitions that had marches on Trenton against police brutality more than once. But we need that we need that pressure to be ongoing. So I've been told that there are people in Princeton that want to create a police review board. People should support that movement, should support that effort. You know, that's one way to do it. You know, and when there are police brutality cases and people are calling demonstrations, people should participate in those demonstrations. You know, whether they be in Princeton or whether they be in Trenton, or if you can go to other places and support demonstrations, do that. Right now, Black Lives Matter is on the ground, organizing and mobilizing in Memphis. I bet most people didn't even know they had called for a national day of action on Saturday. Imagine if we had had that same level of activity that we had for George Floyd this past Saturday in towns and cities across the country. That's the headwind that pushes people to make reform. When they see they have no choice but to implement these reforms, or, you know, face people at the ballot box or face people in town hall meetings who expose their lack of courage to do the right thing. So we need protests. There are a number of bills in the legislature now. If you just go to like any number of organizations, you can find out what those bills are. I mentioned some of the reforms already, but the main one we're fighting for with regard to police is the Police Review Board with subpoena power bill. That's A1515. We need people to write letters, make phone calls, text blasts, emails, meet with your legislators, tell them to become co-sponsors of that bill. Tell the Speaker of the Assembly and the President of the Senate to release the Assembly version and the Senate version from committee so that these bills can go to the floor for a vote. I believe, even though I don't think police review boards will stop police brutality, I do believe it will have an ameliorating effect. And I do believe that it will send a strong signal to police that they need to change their behavior. I've seen this happen. We had so many police brutality cases in Newark that we called on the Justice Department to come in and investigate, and they did. Just knowing that the Justice Department was in Newark investigating calmed the police in Newark down. Did it eliminate all of it? No, it didn't eliminate it all, but then you could see from that year that the numbers of shootings began to fall. In fact, the year 2020, there were no shooting deaths. There was brutality, but there were no shooting deaths in Newark. That was the longest record of no shooting deaths. But that record was broken on January 1st when Carl Dorsey was killed. So in some, and I guess we'll have some question and answers, I would say that people should continue to organize, continue to mobilize around the various bills for police reform. And we would especially appreciate it if people would get behind that police review board bill with subpoena power A1515. Get your legislators that represent the districts in which you live to be co-sponsors and pledge to get that bill. And I'll stop now. I know I talked too long. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Larry. That was really a deep dive. You really gave us the deep history and roots of this problem of police brutality. And thank you so much for spending that time with us to help us understand it more deeply. In a few moments, we're going to have the question and answer, but I want to just call for a few people to add some short remarks. And actually, I would like to call on Lou Maltby next, because he has some information that directly relates to Larry's primary recommendation about civilian review boards. So Lou Maltby of the Princeton Civil Rights Commission, go ahead and say a few words.
Thank you, Bob. As Bob said, my name is Lou Maltby. I'm a civil rights lawyer. I'm a member of the Princeton Civil Rights Commission, and I've been leading an effort with the Civil Rights Commission for 2 years now to get some kind of action taken to improve the quality of police in Princeton. We don't have George Floyd's here. It's not that bad, but it's Princeton. It's not Camelot. Everything is not perfect. And if you ask, why has it taken 2 years to get anything done in a liberal democratic city like Princeton? The answer is because city council and the mayor think that nobody cares. And the reason they think that is that there were how many people out the other day to protest against the murder of Tyree Nichols? How many letters and emails and phone calls have come into the mayor and city council since that event saying, we want to know what you're doing about this? None. Not a one. In fact, I could count the number of emails and phone calls that have come into city council about this issue since I started working on it 2 years ago on my fingers. I'd have some left over. The demonstrations, this webinar is important. The demonstrations are important, but before City Hall is going to move, they need to believe that the people of the community care. And I can't say I blame them. City Council and the mayor have got bombarded with demands by everybody under the sun. They can't do everything. They're going to act on the issues and the problems that the citizens of the town tell them they care about. The Civil Rights Commission is actually engaged in some, let's call them discussions now, with City Council and the mayor that could move the ball forward in this area. And if you want, I was about to call this a request. I think I'm going to call it an opportunity instead. Oops, Wait a second. Bob, I'm trying to put up something in the chat box. Oh, wait a minute.
While you're doing that, thank you, Lou, for
Hang on,
giving
so I'll just take a second.
us that local, and Lou will be posting something in the chat
I'm
box
posting it
shortly.
right now.
Yeah. So watch for that.
Hang on,
And
Bob.
thank you, Lou, for
Bob.
yeah. Just click it to have it go to everyone, Lou.
Yep.
Okay.
I just
There it is.
posted the email address.
Yes,
of
there
Lisa,
it is. Yeah.
who is the head of the Princeton City Council. And I'm only asking for 1 minute of people's time. Just take 1 minute, send me an email that says, police transparency and accountability is very important to me. What are you doing about it? That's all it will take to make a real difference. And we can actually win this one, but we just need some people to step up and tell the city government that they care. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. It's really helpful to have that local handle, and obviously that was mostly targeted toward those of us who live in Princeton, but I really thank you very much for your leadership on this, Lou. Now I'm going to call on one more speaker, but while she's giving a brief talk, you can go ahead and be putting questions into the chat box for Larry. So our final speaker tonight is Caroline Clark, and she is representing Not in Our Town Princeton, an excellent anti-racism group. And so Caroline, please.
Good night, everyone. I'm going to be even briefer than I initially intended. Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Lou.
Thanks.
All right. So thank you both for laying out police reform initiatives, the history of policing and police reform initiatives. My position is, since policing and policing tactics were born out of overseeing and catching runaway slaves, if we want to reform over policing and bad policing, then we should start by getting rid of slavery in the United States. The 13th didn't free enslaved Black bodies, it federally authorized the continuation of slavery under the guise of punishment for criminality. So what's the initial step in establishing criminality? The police stop. It's important that we understand the role of the police. I used to do police accountability work as far back as 1994. I noted that white cops, Latino cops, Black cops, all stopped and abused citizens at the same rate. White cops stopped and abused white citizens the least. Latino cops and Black cops did the same. And white cops stopped and abused Black citizens the most, and Latino and Black cops did the same. So the takeaway, simply put, is that putting Black or brown faces in traditional white spaces does not address the oppression intrinsic to white supremacy. Change requires the cultivation of a different shared value, a different value about the purpose of incarceration and the root causes of poverty, a different and shared value about the immorality of criminalizing and then monetizing human beings. I just read an article where Massachusetts is proposing that prisoners can exchange their organs or marrows for reduced sentence. This makes my point. Incarceration is not about punishment for crimes or danger to society. It's about money and body autonomy, notions that are central to slavery. I would be remiss if I didn't speak about police abuse in my own backyard right here in Trenton, New Jersey. An elite police squad referred to in news articles as the Jump Out Boys shot a 28-year-old Black man, Jawan Henderson, sitting in a parked car drinking iced tea. Jawan refused to exit his car upon command because he knew. And after they shot Jawan, the police handcuffed him and charged him with criminal misconduct. Jawan is now paralyzed. Neither the city of Trenton nor the newspapers contemporaneously reported that violent police encounter with yet another unarmed Black man. It wasn't until a month and a half later that Jawan's lawyer allegedly couldn't get local coverage, so he went to a national publication about the story. City Council said the national story was the first time they heard about the shooting. And it was at that time that the mayor finally addressed the need for the police to release the body cam. 1 year later, we still don't know the names of the officers. When will Black Lives Matter relative to police encounters? I agree. We need a civilian review board with subpoena power, and we need a real change in how we define criminals.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was very challenging and provocative. So we really appreciate your adding that to our discussion. So I do see a few questions in the chat box that I'd like to have you primarily address, Larry. And the first one is about the relationship between the slave patrols putting down slave rebellions and the militia discussed in the Second Amendment of the Constitution. In fact, the person who submitted this has shared a New York Times article about it, so I'll put that out to everybody. But Larry, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think there's a facile relationship between the two. The right to bear arms the mention of the arms in the Second Amendment had everything to do with enabling colonies to form militia to in fact put down slave revolts, because there was a strong, remember at the beginning of the founding of the country, there was not a strong central government. Remember, we went through some, well, I say we, I was enslaved at the time. The colonies went through some changes, first with the Articles of Confederation. That was one way to attempt to unify the colonies, and that didn't work out. And then they went to a constitution with a stronger central government. But many of the southern colonies were very suspicious of the northern colonies. And they felt that maybe some of the northern colonies would not give them the kind of support they needed when they had to put down these slave rebellions. So this question of an armed militia is directly related to the use of force of arms to put down slave rebellions. One of the things that I found over time is that almost all of the fundamental pillars upon which our society rests all somehow were related to the question of enslavement and race. I mean, the further you dig, the more you see, just like with the Electoral College, and I'm sure I don't have to talk long about that. People know that the Electoral College was formed to give the southern states more representation, in the government. And these were the slave, well, I'll put it another way, they were the larger slaveholding colonies. Never forget that there was slavery in New Jersey and all the other colonies. Never forget that. New Jersey was the last state, the last northern state to abolish slavery. It never actually, at least at that time, did not pass the 13th Amendment. It was not passed in New Jersey. The 13th Amendment wasn't passed. I mean, I don't want to get off course. I want to stay with the police, but that's a whole nother lecture. But in short answer, yes, those two issues are related.
Thank you.
Another question.
Another question. So do you think Well, how widespread do you think police brutality is in New Jersey? Do you think the Attorney General's use of force guidelines have had much impact?
No, they have not had much impact. And if you want to delve into just how big a problem it is, look up the Star Ledger's Force Report. The Star Ledger did an ongoing series on police brutality in New Jersey called the Force Report. And if you read those articles, it will give you a good sense of just how widespread a problem this is. Also, the Asbury Park Press did a similar feature before the Force Report. Their report was called The Shield. The Shield with the Asbury Park Press and the Force Report with the Star Ledger. That's some in-depth investigative journalism that will help you to understand just how widespread an issue it is. And it is a widespread issue in New Jersey, in the nation. I mean, look, tonight, Biden has the parents of Tyree Nichols at the State of the Union address. 10 years ago, president wouldn't even talk about police brutality, right? 10 years ago, wouldn't even talk about police brutality. Tonight, the parents of a young man killed by the police are the president's guests at the State of the Union address. That goes to show you just how deep a problem this is. It is costing states millions of dollars. And you know, the municipalities, they have PR people that can keep stuff quiet. Millions of dollars in settlements are made every year by cities and towns that lose in court. Now, imagine if, in fact, all the cases actually went to court. But with the cases that do go to court, I think in the Shield report, the year that they produced that report, municipalities had paid out $200 million in settlements of cases where citizens said that they were either abused or brutalized in some way by the police. So it is a widespread problem.
Thank you. One more question for you, Larry, and then I also want to get in a question for Caroline before we end. The last question for you is, how can we teach the community what justifiable force is so that when they are on a jury, they know how to evaluate the use of force?
Well, that's a very good question. And that's a question I was discussing with an attorney today. And she was giving yet another dimension of why, you know, cops are rarely convicted in these police brutality cases, because citizens come with a predetermined set of ideas about the police. And it's really hard to get some of these grand juries, particularly as they're composed, because most of them probably don't have a majority that look like the victims of police brutality on the jury. That's a whole nother issue we need to talk about. But suffice it to say that this is a problem that we have to deal with through education. This is why protest is so important. And I know people, you know, a lot of people like, protest doesn't do anything. Let me tell you, protest is what brings these issues to public attention. If it hadn't been for protests, Chauvin would have never been convicted for the murder of George Floyd. They were trying to move away. They were trying to move in the other direction until it became impossible for them to do so. And they knew they had to convict Chauvin. Protest is so important, brothers and sisters. I'm not saying you got to be in the street every day, but protest is our primary weapon. See, some people think it's writing letters and it's telephone call. Yes, those are important. They are also weapons we must use. But our atomic bomb, the people's atomic bomb, is protest. And let me tell you, if you don't use your right to protest, they will take that from you. You look at states like Florida, you know, in states all across the country, you know, you heard about what they're doing, like with voting rights laws, 440 bills introduced in 49 states to curtail people's right to vote. You heard about what they're doing to try and stop Black history, 500 bills introduced in 42 states to prevent CRT, which is really a code word for Black history. What you don't hear about are the bills introduced to infringe upon people's rights to freely assemble and exercise freedom of speech. That's going on in America right now. You know, and one of the reasons why we need civilian oversight, community control of the police, is because you can't have a coup without the support of the police and the military. Was anybody listening to what was being said in the aftermath of the attack on January 6th? The fact that there was widespread support among police for the people who attacked the Capitol, that many of those who attacked the Capitol on January 6th were police officers and active military personnel, that the Secretary of Defense said white supremacist ideology is so widespread in the military, he doesn't know what to do about it. If you don't believe any of this, all you have to do is Google it. Google white supremacy, white supremacists in the US military. Google white supremacists. I mean, somebody leaked the membership list of the Oath Keepers. How many military people were in the Oath Keepers? Police people were in the Oath Keepers. Politicians in the Oath Keepers. These are folks who are openly supporting fascism. Fascism is a danger in this country right now. It's white supremacy, it's racism, but it's also fascism. What DeSantis is doing in Florida is fascism. It ain't even neo-fascism. It's the same thing Nazis were doing in Germany in the 1930s, banning books, burning books, getting people out of the universities that didn't toe the Nazi line. That's what's going on right now in Florida and in other parts of the United States. We have the New York police force alone is larger than the armies of most countries, of at least half the countries. You know, the small countries don't have armies as large as the New York police force. You know, it's a frightening thing, and people don't want to. You know, they want to look away. You can't look away. You have to look at reality. And you have to take a stand, you know, because once this stuff gets loose, once that genie gets out the bottle, it's hard to put it back in, brothers and sisters.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Larry. And let me just slip in this last question is for Caroline. How do we go about changing the 13th Amendment that allows slavery in prisons? Anything briefly on that, Caroline?
That's a topic that's a little bit dense for a brief response, but I want us to be clear that while the culmination happens in the prison, and that's where we can actually see it, it starts before we get to prison. It starts in the schools, in the curriculum that we teach. It starts at our Board of Education meetings. It starts in banning certain things in our libraries. Those things are also facets of enslavement. How do we go about undoing that? Like any other amendment or any other constitutional you know, issue that we have. We have to rally, we have to protest, we have to organize, and we have to get a referendum out there.
Well, again, we've been so blessed to have this excellent presentations and discussion tonight. Let me just say a few things as we close. We're right up close to 8:30, so we're going to end close to on time. That just to reinforce Larry's point that protests matter. And I think one of the first times I worked closely with Larry in the 1990s was the New Jersey Coalition for Justice. And you remember that at
Yes.
that time, New Jersey was the epicenter of racial profiling in the whole United
Yes.
States. We were the worst state.
Yes.
And Reverend
Yes.
Sharpton came in here and lots of people, clergy, Black clergy, others, Larry's group, so many of us came together. And what that led to was being put under review and control by the US Attorney General's office. And
Right.
that led to real change. So our
Yes.
protests make a difference. I want to reinforce that. Don't give up. Don't be pessimistic. Don't be defeatist. Don't be cynical. Now, last thing I want to say is very shortly, we're going to have the video of tonight's webinar on our website, peacecoalition.org. It'll be under recent events. But not only the video, we mobilized for a previous version of A1515, the Civilian Review Board bill that Larry was mentioning earlier. We're going to reactivate that alert. And so that also will be available on our website. It'll make it very easy for you to be in touch with your state legislators to urge their support for this bill. It really needs an uprising of public opinion, as Larry said so well. They need to know that people care. Lou also said that. So take all these things seriously, do these little small actions, and they really add up. Thank you all for spending this time
Thank you,
with us
Larry.
this evening. I thought it was an excellent program. Thanks to all of our presenters, and have a wonderful remainder of your evening.
Good night.
Unmute and applaud.
Good night.
Good night.
you.
Thanks,
Larry.
everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Caroline.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Lou. Thank you,
Thank-
everybody.
That's great.
Good night.
Good night. A really good night.